how many legal problems do you think we could fall into in the course of a podcast? Actually, I thought there were 3, but there's 4. There's Peter Mandelson, Rami. There is the actor formerly known as Prince Andrew.Closer. There is the row over the Lord Advocate and the revelation of Peter Murrell's charges to the First Minister a year ago. And there is the General Secretary of the Alba Party and his potential role in the downfall of the aforementioned and the decision not to stand candidates. So there's all of that to discuss, plus the rest of the news. There's a by-election coming up tomorrow. How does Labour fare? There's stuff for Scotland that really matters, ideas about local control, ideas about community wealth building that could actually transform the face of Scotland. All of that's coming up in the podcast. Here's the business.
Well, hi folks, and welcome to this week's Lesley Riddoch podcast. Another boring old week where nothing has happened, no major scandals. It's hard to actually dig up enough information in order to facilitate recording a podcast, but we do try with the little scraps of news that hang about in Scotland.
Well, this is... It's ridiculous. I was just saying to Fraser, I mean, I can sort of see why Pat gave up. I'm not being funny here, but it's such a, you try to keep abreast of the news. So as soon as we finished a podcast, I'm sort of beginning to become a little bit alert to what might make, a story for the following week. Because you often forget the things that have happened on Wednesday, after or Thursday after we've recorded. And to be honest, everything that happened yesterday is out of date. The day before feels like ancient history. I mean, you have to keep reminding yourself, had Andrew been lifted by the time we spoke last time? And kind of now, we could talk about Mandelson. Fear not, everybody, we will. But, you've already, you'd have to be on another planet not to have already kind of semi-digested all of that. So that things are running at such a rate of knots here, it's just almost impossible. And your brain burls, I keep meeting people at all the screenings of the Finland film, and thanks to all the organisers of the events, because they've been absolutely brilliant so far, and big crowds with loads of questions as ever. And people will come up and say, well, it's grand that you're doing this podcast because I couldn't get my head around it. And you think, well, actually, I think this is scrambling my brains completely trying to keep it up with it, because it's, there's a level of just detail of what's literally happening. Then there's a bit of analysis of I write, which kicks in pretty quickly. Like the energy stuff this morning, £117 off, the price cap. Okay, fine. We've still got the highest, energy bills in Europe in Scotland, despite all the energy that we've got. And that money, by the way, everybody, that 117 quid that's being taken off is just going on to bit into tax, because that's mostly a lot of kind of green measures. So we'll still end up paying for it, albeit it'll be a bit more progressive because it's taxation, not bills. Right, there I've wasted 5 minutes already, and that's on a tiny aspect of what's happening. So there's the detail, there's the analysis of it, and then there's the stuff that's getting away, which is most of the time, the really relevant stuff that people are worried about is kind of almost, what are we not hearing? What's not being done, or what's being done badly, or where's the big politics in all of this? And we're not having big stuff. This is completely out of order here, but hey, I've started, so I'll finish. There's a brilliant guy, Simon Pearson, who writes a Substack, hark at me everybody, called Anti-Capitalist Musings. I may have mentioned this before. We'll put this in the notes this time. His latest one is just about the way that politics is working at the moment, where he's saying, reform points at small boats. The Tories point at Strasbourg. The target shifts. The logic is the same. Remove the intrusion, and Britain suddenly recovers its coherence. The boat stops, the court is defied, the community is restored. None of them describes what comes next, because there is no next. The removal is the plan. I'm speechless about this guy. He manages in about, 5 sentences, he's got it. There's nobody, and I'm sorry, even the SNP, looking at where are we going with any of this stuff? Like the big politics stuff seems to be just absent completely. So there's the challenge. I'm just whinging completely here about this, but if you've thoughts on all of this, just you fire away with the old emails, but it's hard to know which things people really want to speak about. And sorry, I've had 3 coffees, so I'm just going to keep going for a second. I was on a Zoom call last night with folk in England mostly who were, worried completely about reform and the local elections there. And you were having to sort of say to them, well, there could be some cheerier news on the Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland, all, producing, if you like, nationalist governments front. And they're hardly able to focus on that because the idea that reform will just take over everything. And what their thinking was, I'm going to throw this at you, my dear, is that they're certain that reform and the Tories will do a pact before the next general election because Danny Kruger, who, I'm having to update all my kind of right-wing BAMs here, has been writing about this and saying there is no way that the right-wing voter will forgive both those parties if they cancel each other out on first past the post.
He is the son of Prue Leith, she of formerly of the Bake Off fame. He's, again, assisted dying and other things, and she's for it. I don't think that they will do a pact. I mean, obviously he has moved to reform, so he's got, better intel in these things than any of us do. But obviously their whole shtick is the Conservatives were crap. So where are they going to let the Conservatives in?
Well, that's what I thought. But what they're saying is these guys apparently in 2019, whatever previous iteration of reform, I haven't been keeping track of it, they sort of stood down quietly in constituencies to let one another kind of have a front go. But, at the moment, because this is what is likely to happen in the Scottish election, that, they will kind of cancel each other out up to a point unless there's a complete collapse in the Tory vote. I must say, I thought it was very unlikely because why would anybody ever vote Tory again if they were just going to get reform, which is full of the nastier aspects of the party that have left them and been blackballed for leaving the Tories? I mean, you couldn't make it up. Right, I hand the stick back to you, my dear. Just you go where you were going to go.
Well, I mean, they did stand aside before in order to let Boris have his majority. I can't even, that was pre-reform days, that must have been...
Yeah, that was 2019.
The Brexit party and all that. So, I mean, but, there's a lot of reporting suggesting that Farage is absolutely, won't let that happen again because the Boris years were so messy and they didn't, really get the Brexit they sort of hoped and dreamed for. Although I think you could equally say that Boris took all the flack for trying to kind of make something out of Brexit, which was impossible to do. I don't see them I mean, obviously there are lots of kind of informal pacts. We talked about one, last time where the Labour Party sort of stood back and let that paedophile councillor come through as an indie. There's certainly places, I mean, if you remember the 2017 election where the 56 were wiped out, or to the most part, there was a lot of strategic goings on and Labour just sort of quietly departing the field, or the Tories quietly departing the field and letting Labour come through in different places in order to try and get rid of all these SNP MSPs. So it does happen to an extent. It also happens, I suppose, to some degree without necessarily the candidate knowing about it. So you might be knocking your pan in, doing a local campaign, but actually the sort of helicopter stuff, the 30,000 feet campaign, where they're spending money on digital advertising, where they're doing extra door drops, don't happen for you because you're not one of our top targets. And that's not something that you necessarily get clued into as a candidate. You just, find out that sort of your pal in the neighbouring constituencies had, thousands of pounds worth of natural campaign spend targeted at their constituency, and you've got hee-haw because you're not flavour of the month, or we don't think that we're necessarily going to win back your seat. So yes, it could happen.
Anyway,
I don't see that. If you think about,
don't spend too much time on it, Fraser, because we need thousands of other things to go through today.
But as I was saying previously with old Baroness Davidson, are you going to vote for a kind of mealy mouse? If you're that type of voter, do you want a kind of middle of the road Conservative, or do you want somebody that's actually kind of proud to be a Conservative and is just going to go for it? I think people tend to go to the kind of brands that they think are going to be successful in politics, and I'm not sure the Conservatives have any way of recovering for that.
Can I just point out, Ruth Davidson is younger than me, but there you go, just fine.
Well, she can still be good old Baroness Davidson of things. So yes, all to play for. Although in terms of polls, there's a cracking poll out this morning from the Times, commissioned by Stonehaven, showing the SNP set to benefit very much from strategic voting to keep Reform UK out of constituency seats, and suggesting that the SNP will actually win an outright majority, which I'm not convinced by, but that they will hoover up vast amounts of constituency seats and, of course, take no list seats, despite the fact that as the election hots up, I'm sure we'll be seeing a whole both votes SNP being pushed to the fore.
Yeah. And then if people are thinking, well, this brings us on to the parlous state of Alba.
Yes.
And thank you for, now, who was it, Seamus, who got in touch to say, look, if you can all say Kiev properly now, can you just say Alba properly? Because all the Gaels are getting really annoyed about the fact we're all saying Alba. Yeah. There's a little written consonant vowel in there, which happens with quite a lot of Gaelic words, like Ardna Murchan. There's an A in there as well. It's kind of quite difficult to pick up. So forgive us, Gaels, you keep needing to hear it said before you realise it's there. So, Alba, the party.
Well, you have to say Alba, the party, because that's the other thing. I mean, both of us are good pals with Delina McLennan, the Gaelic broadcaster, who gets very vexed, not just at the Alba being properly pronounced, but also that you have to add a party, otherwise you're just saying, Scotland is not standing for election, or Scotland is, in a perilous state. I mean, that was quite something from the Alba Party leader, Kenny McCaskill, at the weekend, pulling the rug out from under all of his candidates' feet without any kind of prior warning, and suggesting that there's no possibility of them even standing in the election.
Yeah, I mean, this is. I was speaking to Mike Mackenzie, who's a friend of mine. He lives on the island of Easdale. You possibly know him, Fraser. He was the chief whip actually in the SNP back in the day, and a pretty good operator because he's a builder, to trade. So a very practical guy. And he got a bit disillusioned with the SNP a lot. Left, didn't join Alba for a while. Alba, then did actually join. Kind of has been in and out, like a lot of people actually with that party, but was going to stand again on the Highland list. But I think, the trouble seems to be just that if you have a big hole in your finances and, how many lawyers should we engage to listen to this week's podcast? Because we're going to tiptoe our way through this one and then probably tiptoe our way through everything else. But still, there's been money lost. They're saying it's due to the absent General Secretary who was essentially sacked. But whatever way you want to look at it, there's not enough money to basically finance the campaign or indeed the party by the looks of it. And I know this may be just not a connected thing at all, but I do remember back in the day when I was sort of basically running Harpies and Quines with some other lasses, the scurrilous feminist rag. We ended up in this situation where even though we were actually washing our face finally as a magazine, we couldn't shift a £5,000 debt that we'd carried all the way. And there's a point where as trustees and big grown-ups and directors and everything, you have to, if you're knowingly trading into insolvency, you can be done. And at that point we had, and I can remember just this anger from, and feeling of betrayal actually from some of the lasses when we had to say, look, we can't keep going because unless somebody's going to give us that money straight off, we can't borrow it from anywhere because that doesn't get onto the right side of the ledger either. And it looks like that's the point that they're at, isn't it?
It seems to be. I think it's, as far as I can gather, you have to re-register annually with the Electoral Commission to continue being a political party, a registered political party eligible to stand in elections. And the Alba Party have not been able to complete that process because they can't get an audited set of accounts together owing to the financial irregularities which have resulted in the arrest of their former party chair, not party chair, what was he called?
General Secretary.
General Secretary, which always sounded quite Politburo-ish to me. But anyway, the General Secretary left with financial questions pending. There was also the problem that the General Secretary was the nominating officer. If you recall, there was a kind of story that they wouldn't be able to stand because he was refusing to sign a piece of paper to say that he would relinquish that role. And the Electoral Commission were saying, well, unless he signs it as the current role holder saying he's passing it over, you can't get back in. You know, the SNP are not winning any list seats. There are, the Alba Party, I see Kenny Farquharson writing in the Times saying it was a dreadful vanity project, put together by Alex Salmond in order to pursue his vendetta against Nicola Sturgeon. It reflected also, and I don't accept the premise of that, a significant disaffection by long-standing, hardcore SNP members that had been in there since the year dot, that thought their party had morphed and run away with itself and was no longer accountable, and they thought there were big question marks over the way Peter Murrell was running the party, and they were not happy with the lack of transparency, and they didn't think that the lines that were being put out by the great and the good, that there were no problems with the £600,000 and that there was could spend that tomorrow if there was an independence referendum called, despite the fact there's clearly not showing in the accounts. And they were completely scunnered and they left. And the Alba Party gave those people a home. It was also a home to people who wanted to develop policies and who were interested in actually taking Scotland forward and focusing on the cause of independence, and were critical of the kind of slowly proposition that the SNP are being accused of being put forward. So it gave people a political home who were disaffected. And you've got 3 or 4 unionist parties you can vote for. There were at that point only 2 independence parties, and as I suppose you would say, if we had a truly proportional system, all these bigger parties would split off into smaller units with kind of more directly represented individual views rather than having these broad churches. But this is a real disaster for the Alba Party. I don't see how they can recover from this if they don't stand in the election. There was a poll out showing that we're going to get 2 MSPs who are starting to potentially have breakthrough, but they, as I said before, even prior to us kind of understanding the depth of these financial problems, that because they weren't going to stand in the constituency seats, they weren't going to have the exposure, and they didn't seem to have the financial backing in order to really prosecute their case, nobody was going to hear from them. And unless you were a really sort of invested voter, you were not going to go and dig that information out. You weren't going to receive it through the door, and their vote share was going to suffer as a result. So this is pretty terminal, I think.
I don't agree with you on this analysis of Alba. So at long last, we have some disagreement in the podcast, which is, fine. There's loads of reasons why people did leave and join Alba. But the difficulty to me about a party is that if the reason for its creation is something another party has done, it will always be wobbly. Because, when you talk about the other unionist parties, and we've been through this before, their core reason for existence may have shifted over time, and that's why they're losing a lot of traction. Since Labour doesn't seem to represent, the labouring classes anymore, it's losing. That's why it's going to lose the next election, because it's shifted too far from what people think its purpose is. The Tories were always about capital. The Lib Dems were always flopping around in the middle somewhere. And the trouble with Alba is it can't just be the party of disaffected SNP people, point 1. Point 2, there's a tremendous thing in Scotland where instead of just fucking fighting through till you fix the thing that you've got, you go off and you start something else. Now, I mean, this is also true within the independence movement. There's blimmin' loads of smaller groups. And yourself, I've tried to say to people, let's just see if we can actually just overcome this thing and try to just do something together for once. But the difficulty there will keep being that, and I'll quite give, there was people who tried their damnedest to get through to the top of the SNP and affect things. And of course, you yourself were involved in that along with Joanna. But you can't just have a sort of opting out into another party and hope to give it a grounding, because also to exist simply to be able to scoop up the second vote. There's a sort of, for sure, the electoral system was devised by unionist parties at London. Dems the breaks, that's the thing they set up. So, there was a long time where the SNP came off the wrong way of that because they were second everywhere and they got nothing. But then eventually it's moved the other way. If there was a proportional system, the SNP would get far fewer seats, and actually the unionists would probably get more altogether. Now I'm stuck a wee bit because I certainly want independence. By hook or crook, yeah, actually, I'd just about be there, but only just about, because I think the Scots, I'm thinking about the last time I heard William McIlvanney speak about what would be the national saying of Scotland, and he said, contrary to all the stuff I wrote when I was younger, based on the big man theory, Doherty and the like, he said, I think actually the national saying of Scotland is, that's no fair. And this thing about fairness, if you're going to have a sort of anything less than a 90% vote for independence, which is what all the Nordics had, and then there was no question, just, no argument basically. But you're going to have a lot of losers consent here, because it's probably going to be 60, 65% or whatever when it comes to the day. So it has to look like it wasn't just huckled over the line. So for me, on all those fronts, I have worries about a party. I would like to see a party that has got a very big core, different set of policies and strategies at its core, and happens to support independence to get it, to be in the constellation. And if I was a bit younger, I'd probably blow and try and do it, but I haven't got the energy, because nobody, for example, Alba included, I'll never get this right, nobody is looking at the complete absence of any local dimension to control in Scotland. The centralisation of it, the top-downness of it, they're all the same. And if nature abhors a vacuum, and politics does too, there's the spot where there's something new to create that would have a kind of philosophy to it. The Greens dip in sometimes, but mostly dip out. And that's, to me, where there was a gap. It's not one that Alba has filled. So it's a shame, because I really respect and like so many of the people that are involved in it. But I think it's almost been, to me, like a lean-to shed. It's dependent on the house being there. Otherwise, it just kind of falls over. So after a while, if you take pelters against the SNP, you are going to lose stability, because you kind of, in a funny sort of way, have a symbiotic relationship with the thing that you seek to replace.
Perfectly fair analysis. I think Alba certainly were doing a significant amount of policy development, but they were at no point really able to take that over the line. And one of the things that I thought that Alba could do very easily, certainly because from the last general election onwards, would just have been to get out there and campaign and ask people their views on independence, and then potentially go back to those independent supporters at election time and ask them to lend them their second ballot vote. But I don't think Alba really been, there have been good sort of local examples of them being out and campaigning and canvassing, but not something that was ever really taken forward very seriously.
That's a really, really tall ask, Fraser. I going around the various places, like Musselburgh, for example, where I was, God love those women in Musselburgh. They could blooming run the planet, those women that put that event together. And it's a good example again. They should be running Musselburgh. It should be a small council, and women like that, and guys, but, who are very capable organisers, should be just running the show instead of, being part of the enormous East Lothian. Anyway, by the by. But those guys have still got stalls out the whole time, and they're really struggling to keep going. It's a hard, long shift those guys have put in. So, it's a tough thing to keep saying that the route to this is to have grassroots kind of activism from Alba people, when those people who've been at it longest even are really struggling to keep going, because it doesn't look to them like there's light at the end of the tunnel. Now, I know this is paradoxical, because you're sort of saying, well, that's what Alba should have been trying to say. Look, we will get light at the end of the tunnel, because we will get MSPs elected, and then we do have a different looking parliament. But you could say, we've already got a strategy with the Greens, which we're not even mentioning here. I mean, we're talking all of this about 2 seats likely, but the Greens are likely to get a lot more than that. And even then, the strategy of the SNP is almost not to acknowledge the Greens as part of the majority. So what difference would it have made?
And also not to really sort of loop them in properly into any sort of independence campaign planning, or to have a neutral and accepted national campaign. As far as we understand, that Nicola Sturgeon, after the previous referendum, was determined that there wouldn't be any kind of replacement for Yes Scotland, and that the SNP were going to carry everything forward themselves. And I don't think that's set us up in a particularly good position, as you say, with lots of these kind of
and the trouble is, we kind of knew that, I mean, from the minute I can remember when they just, did they buy the logo or just take it? But it made that, like, I stubbornly won't have that multicoloured logo on my car. I've still got the old Yes logo from 2014 right, stuck out with sellotape now. Because that, and, you've got to say, that was a pretty SNP-led thing. So I know lots of people will be saying, God, you're always hitting the SNP. And, I must say, it's a tough gig, and I would not put myself in the position of trying to lead that party or know the better way forward. However, my instincts would always be collaborative. And I know that's probably why I'm not in party politics, because the adversarial system that is at the heart of Scottish politics, even though it was set up supposedly to be cooperative with, a bit of proportionality and a kind of circular shaped parliament, we're still a very adversarial bunch. And of course, the polarisation around independence has exacerbated that. So it's all very difficult. But to me, the point is, I want to feel a bit of glowing admiration. It's a bit like actually all the sporting stuff. My God, I could not believe it that I actually was watching the rugby when Scotland pulled back and beat Wales.
It was incredible. Even I was watching the rugby when Scotland pulled back and beat. Yes, dear listener.
And I mean, I'm not even all that keen on, but I was screaming my head off. I was hoarse for days. And the thing is, you now get cocky enough that, okay, we watched the oh gosh, my brain's just stopped. Winter Olympics, the curling, which is typical, the one that you might have expected to be a bit of a slam dunk Wisney. But there, I was saying to my pal that I was watching it with, here we are today that we're going, we're only second best in the world, So well done, the curling guys and everybody. But the point is, that sort of feeling where you can get confidently watching sporting events that involve Scotland now. I know it'll go and, after a wee run like this, it'll all go a bit pear-shaped again. There's me, Scott. But on the other hand, at the moment, it's great because you feel like, okay, I can watch that. I might go to that. This could work. We could win. That kind of thing. We need that politically. And you need it from the big boys and girls. You need that from the national team. And so it's fine. Everybody, and I'm involved in it from the sidelines, and for sure, the stadium can certainly help the team. But we need to a stage where we've got something a lot more kind of upbeat on offer, because, around the margins, lots like Reform are nibbling away, particularly in rural Scotland, and particularly wherever anyone's had a bust up over wind farms. When there's not a coherent policy to offer on these kinds of things, folk aren't stupid, and they're beginning to realise that they're just sitting being told what to do by Edinburgh. I'm sorry, that is the size of it. And actually, the islands thing, now you picked this up, the second island bill or whatever it is.
Cool segue on there, but you jumped ahead of it yourself.
Cool on then, Maha.
Well, I thought these people in Musselburgh could be a SAM, a single authority model. You're like, what the heck? So this is the Scottish Government's National Islands Plan. We have had an islands team and an islands plan for a number of years, and it's continually being refreshed. This is the latest version, which seems to talk about community empowerment. But I mean, I've read the sort of précis that they published the last couple of days, and I could not make head nor tail of what a single authority model was supposed to be, and it certainly didn't sound like they were actually genuinely going to devolve power locally and focus on kind of right-sized, if you're an island, then you probably are a council, because the idea of getting 2 ferries to go from Rothesay to Campbelltown is not really your ideal opportunity for being a councillor, to go to a council meeting. And
right. There's a lot going on here, and it's just doesn't seem very good to me. So this is the second National Islands Plan. The first one, I think, came around the time, actually, the whole idea seemed to have kicked off around the referendum time, when the Orkney and Shetland Islands in particular, were being a bit cute and realising that they had 2 governments they could play off one another to try and get a bit more power for them. So there was a lot of pandering, completely paying attention to Orkney, Shetland and the Western Isles. So here we are again. I think there's a huge push on to get Hannah Mary Goodlad elected for the SNP in Shetland, and she's a great candidate. Why wouldn't you have her in there? So John Swinney was up the road. He's been up the road twice to Shetland, actually. And then I noticed as well, small kind of detail, but big for if you're in Shetland, is that they have capped the ferry fares for Shetland, and probably Orkney as well. And there was always an annoyance by Northern Ireland, it sounds like, but people from the North Isles, that they never got the RAT, the road equivalent tariff, that the Western Isles got back in 2007, long time ago, which made ferry fares to the Western Isles a lot cheaper. But Orkney and Shetland stayed with kind of pretty scary fares. So anyway, they've capped them there so that they stay sort of off-peak all the year round. Now that is something that successive candidates, because I've been up there canvassing for many of them, including the estimable Tom Wills, and they couldn't get past this, because people would just say, but your government is presiding over these sky-high ferry fares, and there you are, you're stuck. So the fact that there's been movement on that suggests that that the Scottish government is willing to move a lot to get, the Shetland public opinion on the side of a lass who is also the daughter of the guy who has run the Fishing Association in Shetland for forever, and is a very estimable guy within the community. Anyway, so there we are, Shetland. I think when you're at it, you've got to, if you do something for Shetland, you have to play fair with the other islands, and so probably you've got to start talking about the whole islands plan. One of the things that the Shetlanders also want, as we've talked about before, is they want fixed links, as in tunnels for Yell and Unst. They don't want more ferries because they haven't, they've got enough young folk working on aquaculture, on fish farms and so on. The wages are better. Nobody locally actually wants the ferry jobs. They're getting folk in Faesooth that come up and run the ferries as if they're youngsters, and they're actually venerable old ladies of about 40 years old. So they're knackering them. They're having to wait for parts to come. They're getting stranded. There's folk having to come off a week in advance. The old stuff that islanders have always had, if they're going to hospital, if they're going on holiday, it's crap. And they don't want it anymore. And they're close enough to the Faroes that they've seen what happens there. They want that. So there's support for them now. It has to come sideways because it's Shetland Islands Council that need to come up with the money, and it's a fair bit. But there's some deal being done to kind of basically explore getting those tunnels in. Right. So now we're talking tunnels. So there has to be tunnels elsewhere as well. So now the islands plan, and you'll see this perhaps in the news, is that other fixed links are being suggested for the Outer Hebrides. This was a plan way back before 2005 called the Spinal Route, which was going to make fixed links between if you know your Outer Hebrides, it's fine, but what I'll say now will probably go over your head if you haven't been. But anyway, it would connect up the big long island of Lewis and Harris, then with Berneray and the Uists, and then at the bottom of the Uists, it would connect them with Barra. And the idea then was that you would be able to access healthcare all the way up and down the islands without having to wait on ferries. That just went the way of many things, just there not being enough money, there's not enough of a population. Back then there wasn't the tourism crazy that there is today. And the other thing that happened was the terrible winter of 2005, where a family actually got drowned on a sort of bridge bit near Stonybridge in South Uist, and that put the fear of God into everybody actually about low bridges between islands, because the weather there can be just fierce. So I think now if you were looking at it seriously, you would, and the tunnels are now, it's not crazy stuff that people are seriously talking about tunnels, although the geology is different in all these places. You would have to look at all of that, and that's sort of being discussed. And the bit I'm finally coming to is Mull, because the bit that's just really hit the headlines is the third place is a link between Mull and the mainland. Now, I imagine people would think, well, that's grand because you obviously can see Mull from the mainland. There's the thing about that, though, that just demonstrates where things are at for islanders at the moment is if you were to go on Mull and say, what is the big issue on Mull today? Today, it is the fact that last week, parents who've been campaigning to have a new secondary school located in the middle of the island lost that legal battle. Now, what's that about? Well, the folk in the south of Mull have had to send their kids to school in Oban, taking a ferry away and staying in a hostel for the week and then only coming back at the weekends because they cannot be sent up to Tobermory. It's weirdly deemed closer because, hey, Mull is just one part of the utterly massive Argyll and Bute, and the headquarters of that is not even in Oban, it's in Loch Gilfed, which would take you probably 2 days to reach with ferries and stuff. So people are, there's debate on Mull. People who are near Tobermory are just quite happy that a new secondary goes on the site of the old one in Tobermory. But, everybody in the south of Mull is kind of saying, well, we could have had a new school halfway up in Craigmuir. If we were a Mull local council, we might have come up with that as a suggestion. But it's not happening. So the news that Mull might get a fixed link sometime in the indefinite future, maybe that's supposed to be some long-term solution to the problem that you have to keep sending your kids away to the mainland for education. But it's very long-term, and according to the local people on Mull, they haven't even been consulted about this idea, and there's currently a debate about getting a new ferry. So, this is not going to help the Scottish Government try to persuade anybody that they're on the side of the little people. If you're on the side of the little people, create a Mull council, crack it all down to size and give these guys the power to decide these things.
Well, and then there was also calls for, previous iterations of SNP national manifestos from Michael Russell writing publicly to say that actually Argyll and Bute should be the first for the chop and should be the kind of test bed for implementing proper local democracy, which would suit very well. But there's clearly no appetite for that within the current SNP government.
Exactly. I mean, that's why, of course, I would. This is my thing, right? It is my thing. I'm not going to apologise for this anymore. It's what is missing, I think, in Scottish politics, and why, whatever shape we take when we become independent, because I'm sure we will, it really matters what shape we're in when we get there. And for everybody to kind of go, oh, well, we just have to wait, all of this, we'll get our energy sorted out when we're independent. Of course we will, but we control heat at the moment. Could we get some district heating, please? Now. And equally, we can control what we're doing in terms of local government, and we're not. So, there'll be a few headlines based on this. People will discuss whether or not there should be a fixed link and whether you'd go across to Mull for fish and chips and whether it will wreck the Mull economy and society and whether they'll end up like Skye, which seems to be everybody's terminal fear that once you've got a lot of access happening, islands change. But then, if you actually had a Skye council and a Mull council, they'd have some power to do something about some of the changes that happen when you become very accessible. So it's like the only thing that is really there as a learning, actually, from practically all the Nordic films, including Finland. There they are. 308 councils with 20 regional ones. So roughly 330 councils in Finland, same population as Scotland, 32. And it's one of the big reasons it's a success, so the end.
The end. I think we're also very used to crap. It's a bit like, you're talking about the rewilding films, looking at a barren wasteland and thinking, well, that's what Scotland's supposed to look like. You're kind of used to having not proper infrastructure and everything being a bit dislocated. So it can be very discombobulating for people to imagine what it would be like if it was actually better, and oftentimes you can get a lot of opposition. The other thing is that there are scarce resources and people are concerned about how it will impact them, and that you will still be far away, albeit fixed linked. And if you lose your kind of status as an island, it's perhaps slightly less relevant now we're out of the EU, but your funding might go down, and any kind of special treatment you might have got as a result of being very rural because you were an island goes away because you're now technically connected, but it's still, a camel trek away in order to actually get anywhere else.
But this is still madness because, if you were able to locate if there was more power, for example, take the Western Isles, those guys are awash with energy, just like the whole of Scotland, but more so. They've got a tiny usage of energy themselves and have had to wait all this time. I think they're just on the brink of having a subsea connector connecting the Western Isles to the mainland. They've had a shonky old line that's gone through Skye that's been bust for about the last however many years. They've been relying on diesel generators. The Western Isles, with the highest wind, practically, they could have an argument with Orkney and Shetland on who's got the most, with ideal places for tidal energy, which has also seemingly, had the blimmin' head knocked on it by the related fund for wave energy being ended by the Scottish government. I think the folk who are behind tidal are kind of a bit hacked off that there's this distinct, wave, tidal is a different kind of energy from waves going up and down with the waves. Tidal is going twice a day. It's the movement of the tide, so it's slightly different. And the tidal guys, really think they've still got a shout, but that is not also getting, proper funding. So anyway, if you were to just look in a different world, you would be laughing if you were on Lewis, Harris, any of those islands, because you would have all that local energy. You wouldn't be throwing six to start to feed it into a grid that hasn't been connected to you by a Westminster government that couldn't be arsed, fundamentally. So, the way people have learnt to think about, poor me, I'm on the edge of everything, we've got nothing here, what happens if we don't get stuff given to us? And I know I've just taken a wee tone of voice on. I'm not projecting that really onto people. That is the infantilization that goes with waiting for the centre to let you have what is yours. And that centre is the centre, whether it's Edinburgh, Westminster, Brussels, or wherever. And our country, Scotland, is uniquely badly served in terms of having the power of all kinds where the people are, which is the shift we need.
Indeed it is. And I think that's very apt, and we will continue pushing forward on these localism issues. And the point you make is very correct, and that's kind of what I'm saying. You think, we'll lose our special funding. I think, yeah, but we won't need it because we'll be able to actually thrive here rather than being continuously depopulated and having things set up in a way that isn't actually any use.
Well, there's the sunny old Finns, right? When Helsinki Council doing pretty well, and I did say to them, if you come and see the film, you'll see all sorts of fabby things they can do. And I say, where do you get the money from? Is it from local government, from central government, or what? And they say, no, we actually give money to central government. You go, what? Because they hung on to ownership of their land. So 66% of land in Helsinki owned by Helsinki Council. So they have basically leased it out, whatever. They get a lot of money in as landowners, which then goes back to central government to cross-subsidise developments in less populous parts of Finland. Ba-boom.
Talking about having things properly organised, we've had significant political fallout over the role of the Lord Advocate and the fact that the Scottish Government and the SNP First Minister were given a heads up, not even just a couple of months ago, but actually last year, on the terms of the indictment served against Peter Murrell for the allegations of fraud whilst he was in office as Chief Executive of the SNP, and that these were then kind of circulated round through the special advisors and media spin people within the government in a way that just doesn't sit very well with most people.
Well, I noticed that I'm trying to think who was challenged on this on Good Morning Scotland. Just live with me, I'm never going to get it here. This morning, I think it was Neil Gray actually who was on talking about health, because there's these walk-in clinics that the SNP are unveiling across Scotland. But he had pointed out, because obviously they all have to be ready that they're going to get challenged on this, that the Lord Advocate had said there were 30 occasions before this where the Lord Advocate has briefed the First Minister and indeed the Prime Minister on high-profile cases to ensure there's no contempt of court. And the questioner had, I think it was James Cook, had said, yeah, but a year? a year. That's quite a long time beforehand, and there was no answer to that. So I don't know. The thing is, we're talking about this, and people will have their own views, and we can't go into the Peter Murrell stuff because he's been charged.
Well, it can't get into practically anything. We had to consult our former media lecturer, Mr. Joyce. Pat, can we say it's like pretty much nothing? Actually, having had all these boys arrested has made much less fun, because you can't sort of speculate on any of the juicy details in case you get had up for contempt of court.
Well, yes, although there is all sorts of, they haven't quite been charged with anything yet, but everybody is just being very kind of cautious about it. I mean, the thing with Peter Mandelson that's kind of arisen is that the reason that he was apparently lifted was that he's out this morning, his friend, saying that the police arrested him over baseless claims that he planned to flee abroad to the British Virgin Islands. And that was the reason that they'd lifted him, when it was expected that he would be, talking to the police later than agreed. And then suddenly there was this intervention, which was because they apparently, he says, they were worried about him leaving. And there's a suggestion that police have put restrictions on him travelling overseas as part of his bail conditions. It's unclear normal if that involves surrendering his passport. My God, how the mighty are fallen, but there you go.
1 minute you're having a pee against a wall in a posh London suburb, and the next minute you're looking at the inside of a police interview room, but not for urination in a public place. Just back to the Lord Advocate. I mean, okay, it's happened 30 times before, blah, blah, blah. It was entirely unusual that the person who was arrested was former chief executive of the political party that holds the government in Scotland, and that the people who it was being circulated to were going to potentially be Crown or defence witnesses in the case. So, I mean, it doesn't really pass the smell test. It doesn't look like a very clever thing to have done. The Lord Advocate is a person of significant standing. This memo was going out in her name. Whether she had anything to actually do with it or not is who knows. She has recused herself, of course, from all matters to do with the case. So you'd have thought in that regard that the memo would have gone out in a different name. And it just brings into sharp focus again the fact that we have this dual role. And there's been lots of kind of sucking of teeth and mumping and moaning about perceived bias, because the Lord Advocate is both the government's chief legal officer and also the head of the prosecution service. But, whose fault is that? This role is hard baked into the Scotland Act. It cannot be changed by the Scottish Parliament. There's no powers to do so. And for yesers, I think we should look at it the opposite way. The SNP Scottish Government does not have the benefit of a political law officer sitting in the government, championing your side, wanting to take forward ideologically your programme for government and your desire to split off from the rest of the UK. And these were some of the points that Joanna Cherry made when she had a private member's bill just before the last general election, which sort of didn't proceed any further because of the general election, that really it was actually quite unfair that the SNP Scottish Government or future Scottish governments don't have a law officer who's championing them. They have this much more kind of impartial creature that turns up at cabinet, but is not really on their side, is not a member of their political party. So what you would normally have would be an advocate general, somebody who actually is there to do your bidding, and an entirely independent prosecution service.
So it's kind of betwixt and between, really.
I mean, if you remember back in the day in 2007, in order to sort of depoliticize it, and it was an extremely political role all through history and before devolution, in order to sort of depoliticize it at the same time when they were creating the Scottish Government, changing the branding over, I'm pretty sure in 2007 Alex Salmond announced that the Lord Advocate wouldn't typically sit in cabinet meetings unless they were required, so rather than coming all the time. But you then don't get the benefit of a legal person who's specifically looking for the legal lookout of the government sitting in cabinet going, but maybe Biffa would sue us if we stop this deposit return scheme or what have you. So, it's a real loss. The government could do something about it now if it wished to do, and it was certainly in the 2021 SNP manifesto, but there have been really no proper attempts to make any changes to it. I think the Scottish Law Commission was asked to go and look at it and report back, or there was expert advice was commissioned by the Scottish government, but it's been long grass stuff rather than simply coming up with a plan to replace the role, to split it into two, and to appoint from those people elected a law officer.
But the thing is, I'd imagine for anyone listening to this, they'll be going, by gum, this gets knocked into a cocked hat by everything that you're saying coming from Westminster. And much as we are, dancing around legal stuff about talking about Mandelson and the former Prince Andrew, I mean, for crying in a bucket, there was, and again, there is privilege within Westminster, so that things that you say in the Commons, you can say something that could potentially be libelous anywhere else. And if it's said in the Commons, it is not. And I think repeating it is also not, she said, hopefully. But because most of the papers have reported Tuesday's debate, which was about releasing documents about, former Prince Andrew, Mountbatten, Windsor, whatever, him. That debate was quite extraordinary. It was Chris Bryant, who now I see as Sir Chris Bryant, which is really disappointing because he was, a reasonably good egg within Labour, and he still is actually. But still, I wish people wouldn't take these freaking gongs. Anyway, he's a trade minister, so he got the opportunity to lead this debate off and described the former prince as a man on a constant self-aggrandising and self-enriching hustle, a rude, arrogant, and entitled man who could not distinguish between the public interest, which he said he served, and his own private interest. And by gum, I mean, it was almost worth watching actually, because he's some limber guy, isn't he, Chris? You must have. Did Joanna not do stuff with him?
Yeah, I mean, it's a very great performer. I think that it was quite funny. The whole debate basically was people getting up going, I thought he was an arse when I met him.
Yes.
A complete bastard. And he was very horrible to my team. And even my father, who was an Air Vice Marshal in the RAF, met him at a dinner and he thought he was an arse as well.
And then the thing was, Ed Davey had started this from the Liberals, who's the real frigging hush puppy of the piece. This now everyone goes, oh, Ed Davey, he's just lovely. It's a bit like, Marks and Spencer's. It's kind of special food, isn't it? So anyway, I mean, and fair play. I'm sure he's a lovely guy. But anyway, so he swung in with this humble address to sort of call for the release of the documents. And so I imagine he thinks he's getting somewhere with that. So your man Chris Bryant actually has a go at Ed Davey early in the debate because he defended Andrew when he was a minister during the coalition. And this is the thing, if you live long enough, everybody that just curried into that guy when they had the opportunity to do something different can be had up for it. And I mean, to be fair to Davey, he quickly responded that he'd apologised for this and so on. But still, it's kind of messy now because there's relatively few people that can take a good, clean swipe. And Chris Bryant's one of them.
Well, if we were to actually have a public inquiry about this, which we will certainly not be, what did you know and when did you know it? Almost everybody in the Foreign Commonwealth Office, every overseas ambassador and every overseas mission who received him thought he was an arse and he was useless, and there were plenty of press reports about him insisting and staying in fancy hotels so that he wouldn't be kind of under the watchful guise of the ambassador if he stayed in the ambassador's residence, so that he could have people coming in to visit him, and apparently always travelled with an ironing board, they said euphemistically, which was his massage table, so he could have nude massages allegedly and have escorts and other people coming to
Have we woken the lawyers up? Well, no, because actually, the person weighing into all of this is also Gordon Brown. And I mean, if you talk to English people, they're all, Gordon Brown, he's kind of covering himself in glory because there's a piece in The Guardian, the PM who turned PI, as in private investigator, because he's been absolutely going through a lot of the Epstein files to try and find the detail out. And he was the one that's chased down the idea that a number of British girls were on 90 Epstein flights organised from UK airports on what he called his Lolita Express. And apparently that Epstein used Stansted Airport and boasted at how cheap the airport charges were compared with Paris to fly in girls from Latvia, Lithuania and Russia. So, he's now, his brother is married to a journalist who is, doing an awful lot of the digging on this, but they seem to have, cheerfully dug where many others have feared to go. But there's Gordon Brown, because he was the one who brought Mandelson sort of back in, was he not? When he took him back in from his time in the European Commission, and he was warned at the time that this was a bad move, but he kind of ignored that and said it was, time to bring in better economic expertise, whatever Mandelson would have to say about it. And apparently Mandelson joined Ed Balls in an inner circle that would meet with Brun for, fireside chats every Sunday night. So, there's probably quite a lot of a feeling of guilt at having, same thing as having brought him in and thought this is a player. And actually, the whole of politics and everything in life seems to turn on people who are larger than life, have a very good conceit of themselves, are apparently just recognised, name recognition by other people, have enough, whatever you want to say, chutzpah, arrogance to just think there's a very simple way to get what is wanted, place themselves constantly at the centre of everything, make themselves indispensable, all of that stuff. And, history is littered with how this goes wrong, and yet we seem to fall into it over and over again. But anyway, that's all going on in the background, the Brun, Mandelson, so I'm not putting Brun in the same camp as Mandelson, but the work that he's doing to kind of keep this investigations going, and Mandelson then, obviously, and Andrew. What difference is this going to make, do you think? Do you think it'll make any difference to the May elections and where people are at?
Not in Scotland, I shouldn't think. I mean, it'd be interesting to see how obviously we're all gearing up to hear what happens to Starmer after the May local elections.
Well, there's also the by-election tomorrow, actually.
Yep. And there was a lot of hoo-ha about that at Prime Minister's Questions this afternoon. I sort of think that there were real concerted efforts not to debate anything to do with it in the House of Commons previously. And obviously now he's been sort of stripped of all of his titles and standing and what have you. They've had this debate. They had the previous bit of legislation rushed through to push him down in the councillors of state, so he couldn't stand in, and neither could Prince Harry stand in for the King if the King was abroad. But it's a kind of Pandora's box. I can't remember what the Erskine May phrase is. It's kind of sparing and very respectful or something is what any mention of the royal family. And we saw before around these matters last year with the Speaker Hoyle getting up very pompously and saying, we can't mention these matters and royals. These things require a significant amount of scrutiny, and this is happening now because the evidence which was held is in the public domain. The Metropolitan Police Special Royal Protection Squad have been following him round his entire life. Andrew Loney, the writer who wrote the book entitled, which again contains a significant amount of this type of information, had passed loads of material, he says, to various authorities, including the sort of National Crime Agency, suggesting that there should be an investigation into the financial dealings that went on when Andrew was a UK trade ambassador. There was the house sale and stuff like that, which was all widely publicised in the press. What's it called? Sunninghill Park, which sold for many millions of pounds over the asking price, despite being a kind of dilapidated state. So all of these things have kind of swirled around and been known knowns, but nobody has wanted to look at it or join the dots because it didn't suit. And it now suits very much because these things are in the public domain, but it's still very British. We're kind of, don't prosecute the bankers, don't ask too many questions. Yes, there's a bit of kind of corruption, but it's not as bad as elsewhere. And, keep calm and carry on.
But I wonder whether, because this is what folk were asking me last night, they're all very exercised about this in Ingerland, because it falls into the midst of their conception of themselves, which is now everything's adrift. And as it stands, it looks like Reform are the ones that pick up on that, even though there's no logic to that at all because, the
beauty
haven't got enough time to go into that.
Absolutely, but belies any kind of logic at all. So, as you say, people that can be looking at a hyper-nationalist political party that is swathed in itself in the Union Jack even more than a resurgent Labour Party desperately trying to gauge your vote, will also, put that aside, stick it in a different compartment in their brain and vote for them because they think they're somehow going to upend the establishment. It's a bit like
or just like two fingers to everybody. I've just given up now because nobody's what they're supposed to be. The Tories are shite. You're shite. What's left? And what do you think, just as a matter of interest, any predictions for this by-election tomorrow? Because Labour was supposed to be likely to hold it, which is probably why they didn't thump on too much. Although I noticed that Keir Starmer had a right old go at the Green candidate. Did you hear him were you still listening? When somebody asked him, he'd obviously got a wee crafted question into some totally non-sequitur question put to him when he was thumping on about the Greens wanting to decriminalise a lot of drugs and said that he's got a son who's about 16 and I've never heard him so angry in my life. The idea that he could have heroin thrust upon him legally makes, this was Starmer, makes his blood boil. So clearly that's the sort of, they're worried about the Green vote, aren't they? That basically their vote will just decide they've had it. And that the Green lassie is actually quite a feisty lass. And
you said before, actually pretty sort of hot to trot on interviews and what have you. They are obviously worried about the Green vote, and this drug stuff has been put out as a digital advert. A really kind of sort of grim, hard hitting. The Greens are just lunatic libertarians want to push your grandkids on heroin and smack. Maybe that's the same thing. I'm not too up in my drug terminology. I don't want to seem like a complete ingenue.
Well, I'm sorry, I'm there with you in the kind of gauche corner.
Yeah, but so they've been really pumping that out there as a campaign line. Also makes them kind of look tough on crime, kind of steals some of the Conservative clothes and maybe kind of pushes you back a little bit on reform as well. So that's obviously been something that they've been particularly hammering up. And it almost looked like it wasn't a Labour digital ad, but I'm checked it and I'm pretty sure it was actually a genuine Labour advert. So yeah, that's been a main plank of their election campaign against the Greens and against Zach Belansky particularly.
Yeah, but it seems like the polls have got it very nail-bitingly close three-way between Labour, Reform and the Greens.
Yeah.
I mean, the last poll I'm just seeing now has got the Greens taking the lead, which is like, wow, 30% of voters, Reform and Labour neck and neck on 28%. So it's kind of almost worth, what will it be, the wee small hours of Friday morning or whatever.
I mean, I still think they might just scrape on.
Well, they will have thrown everything at it. I mean, they know how to throw everything at it, as we've seen from Scottish Labour's performance.
And they're also now much more technically adept at running elections, and the Green Party are not. So you might have a lot of nice conversations with people and it might be getting picked up in the polls, but will those people actually go out and vote on the day? And the Labour Party people will, because the Labour Party will have every activist in the land there, and they will have a really keen view on who that they need to go and speak to and who they need to get to the polling station and who they can just completely ignore. And the Green Party, by contrast, will just be all over the place.
That's very true. Do you remember which election was it that I agree with Nick happened? Yeah. And everyone thought, oh my God, the Lib Dems are going to do really well. And then they didn't, because the profile of their voter was younger who didn't tend to vote. So it's a fair point, but still it would be such an upset to see. We'll have to wait and see. Can I just say before we disappear that there's a brilliant film out that would be great for people to catch, which is Everyone Go to Kenmure Street, which is the film that's been made about the Kenmure Street siege in 2021. There was a brilliant long interview with its maker, whose name is not sitting in front of me at the moment, on Scotland Tonight last night. And it really does look fantastic. Emma Thompson is Van Man, which for any of you followed this is kind of a bit mind-blowing. But then Van Man himself, the guy who threw himself under the van to stop the Home Office deporting two, I think it was Sikh chefs. One was a chef and one had another trade. Anyway, there's rapidly thousands of people around that van through the action of lots of networks, refugee networks and just neighbourhood networks, and then just people. He was relating that this was shown in the States and that people were coming to him at the same time this was happening as the ICE officers had shot dead 2 people in demonstrations. And people were seeing, in the States, were seeing a real crossover between it and saying that this was about the first thing that had let them see hope. Because, you know, the film is all about solidarity that just grows, you know. And actually the filmmaker himself was saying that the reason he made the film was that he was in the neighbourhood, saw the kind of call to arms, as it were. Although it wasn't to arms because it was all peaceful, but the call to come and sort of support had gone out. And he'd slightly thought, that won't happen and I don't want to see the disappointment. And then actually he missed the whole thing. And he's honest enough to say that that's what made him think, right, somebody does need to tell that story. And it's apparently been done incredibly well. I'll see if I can find a link that gives you all the screenings. But when I was looking last night, you had to look at each place that you live. And it's all around March the 13th, I think, is the release. Although it's on at the GFT, I think, tonight.
Well, we'll put a link up to that. It's Felipe Bustos Sierra.
Yeah. Because he made the film Ne Passaran about the Scots Rolls-Royce engineers who basically wouldn't make engine parts.
Every time we mention
Chile.
that, some person goes, "Oh my goodness, I didn't realise that." Checks out on YouTube and has their mind
blown
right off. So, you're just going to Google that one yourself, folks. But we'll certainly put a link up to this. Speaking of films, it was the BAFTAs, and there's been a huge kind of social media backlash against Tourette sufferer John Davidson, the Scot who was the inspiration behind the film I Swear, which I saw some of the trailers for, which looked utterly fantastic. And he had the involuntary shouting of the N-word or kind of racist slurs and other things as a result of his Tourette syndrome, which has been picked up by obviously really high-profile Americans, with some people suggesting that this was actually his Tourette's was just a kind of a window onto his soul, and that he was simply a racist white guy, and that his Tourette's just prevents him from filtering his views. It's a great shame for him, and the Tourette's obviously is totally involuntary and almost kind of designed to make you say the most inappropriate thing possible. But this has been a real social media furore over these racist comments.
But I suppose it has, you know, I don't know which way it works, you know, whether it's kind of made people really realise this. There's an interview with him, John Davidson, that says that when he met the Queen, he shouted, "Fuck the Queen."
Yes.
Which is sort of like, oh God. Yeah, you know, so it's a very odd one, but there's plenty to read about it. And I think the point is people will now have looked and thought, I actually don't know about this at all. Yeah. So, I mean, fair play to him, the actor that won, which was so sweet to see that, you know, huge reaction from him as well. And I'm sure we won't have heard more, you know, you will hear more from all of them, including that best actor.
Brilliant. Well, I mean, it was a real shame for him, but hopefully this will blow over. Obviously, he has apologised. The BBC have apologised as well for having not edited it out as they had done with other things when it got broadcast.
Yes, like the other guy who made a comment about Palestine, Free Palestine, that managed to find its way on the floor, whereas this one didn't.
Obviously super acute to that after getting
as usual.
Yeah. Well, that was a good going. If we are doing your media filtering for you and letting you experience the world at large without actually having to watch anything dastardly, you can subscribe to the podcast. It makes a big difference to help us keep going. And you can do that by going on to the Lesley.Riddoch.com and looking at the podcast page. There's information there on how to subscribe. You can either do that as an annual donation or as a wee monthly subscription.
And I should say, because I completely forgot, a subscriber did get in touch, which was the reason I wrote a column about something that could be a bit game-changing, which is the Community Wealth Building Act. That's Mary McInnes. Mary McManus from Belfast, who we talked about a little about this last week and sort of said, well, who knows, the community wealth building thing might do something, but it might not. And she got in touch with me and said, you should know that actually the Scottish CWB bill, which is just the shorthand of it, has gone completely viral across the world on TikTok. And actually, she put a link in. I'll put the link in the notes here. But, it's really getting out about Scotland being the first country to put CWB into legislation. Now, actually, when you look at it, because she had done quite a lot of work on this academically, and there'd been a bit of a push to try and introduce this in Belfast. Belfast sort of bottled it. North Ayrshire didn't. One of the guys who was involved in the Preston adoption of this technique, which really requires councils and all sorts of big employers to prefer local bids, local labour, local businesses, and try to keep the money that's floating about in big procurement contracts totally local. One of the guys who was involved in that was a Scottish guy who comes from near Oban originally. And he had come back up the road, Neil McEnroy. He's very involved in all of this, thanks to Boris Johnson, who set him up in total despair. He decided to come back up the road after Boris Johnson's election. And he was the one that then met up with got advised on this North Ayrshire pilot. He then moved into, he was seconded into the Scottish government. He then found a willing listener with Tom Arthur, who was the SNP minister charged with community wealth building. That put the team together for this legislation. And the point of it is, folks, that what could happen is local action plans will have to be developed now. And what they can decide are things like, we want 4 times more community energy in this council area, or we want 4 times more school and hospital food supplied by local people. And that would change dramatically what local farmers grow. It could offer new possibilities, for example, for food processing companies in their area. And a lot of that isn't already in place. So that would mean quangos like Scottish Enterprise, Highland Enterprise, they might have to spend more time kind of pump priming local development of the businesses needed to supply these local contracts than an inward investment, because the bill makes that kind of transformation compulsory. So it is actually big licks, and thanks very much to Mary for sort of, nudging me on with it, because the reason it's been sort of seen around the world is because Jessica Friday, who's a wellbeing economist, grabbed these headlines on TikTok and Instagram by putting a completely different sort of spin on it, where she was sort of saying, basically, the Scots are billionaire busters. See, that's a long draw through from what I've just described there, which sounds like a bit of a kumbaya sort of, way of doing things. But the net of it is that it will stop billionaire-led companies scooping up all the contracts. Yep. And that's just a great example of somebody who's got their head round social media, which is often seen as the cursed thing, and who's also able to sort of translate complicated stuff into a really, sexy little kind of idea that people are going to watch. Her films have had 4 million views about Scotland being the billionaire busters. So we need to get on with it.
We certainly do. North Ayrshire is quite go ahead. I'm pretty sure it was North Ayrshire were looking at this previously and even kind of considering could they have their own community-owned vertical farm, one of these super groovy buildings with fancy LEDs and what have you, so that they could grow salad crops and things like that for all their schools and hospitals locally rather than having to import them. And that would be one of the things that they wouldn't necessarily otherwise be able to procure locally, but that they could potentially have a kind of groovy solution for. So, the more that these things happen, the more that they shift people's thinking and they shift the economics of it and point it into a much less extractive place. Scotland is a hugely extractive economy. People selling our stuff and taking money out. We need a Donald Trump in to put the barriers up. I don't think so. But we do need to look at how we buy stuff, who we're buying it from, and how we're doing it.
And just because there seems to be a lot of knocking of the SNP, well done, actually, for getting this piece of legislation through, because it was in the manifesto last time round. I don't think anyone expected it to, the team to kind of run with it. It will, I think it has implications that are slightly larger than anyone might be aware of. But everyone locally, get ready for this local action plans, because it really matters then how high the bar is set locally. And there should be a bit more democracy than the average bear to make sure that those things are set for truly local areas. That'll be the next hurdle. But still, nice one.
Great stuff. Well, we'll put up your link to your article about that from the National on Thursday, and also links into those TikToks. And as I said, if you would like to chip in and help the podcast keep going, you can do that by subscribing, and it makes a really huge difference. And we mostly appreciate indeed our subscribers. I think it was just coming up almost to the anniversary, so some people will be getting their annual renewals starting to come through automatically. If you've changed your card details or anything, you can update those on the website, or you can drop us a line. So thanks very much, and on that note, we'll see you next week.